Okay, so we're all set there. So again, welcome. Let me go ahead and get started. Winikisap Mtasuis Casey Thornbrugh, Gan Thomas Mississippi. Good day and hello. My name is Casey Thornbrugh, and I'm a citizen of the Mashi Wampanoag tribe. I serve as the Tribal Climate Science Liaison with United South and Eastern Tribes, and I work closely with both the Northeast and the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. I want to welcome everybody on our quarterly call, especially welcome to those whom this may be your first quarterly call of the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network. This is actually our second quarterly call. The network has been around for several years, but we've tended to meet in person at various conferences and events. And of course, when the pandemic happened, we were unable to do so. So we decided to go forth and have opportunities to meet virtually kind of on a quarterly basis to keep the conversation going. So the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network, it's a network seeking to convene Indigenous peoples and allies to identify threats to Indigenous self-determination and ways of life, and to formulate climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies, dialogues, and education programs, all that build capacity towards resilience to climate change. At some point during our call, I'll leave the web link to the network. I encourage everyone, if you haven't already had the opportunity to do so, to please visit that link and become familiar with the network. As we're coming in, I see a lot of faces of people I know, which is wonderful. Please feel free to also add into the chat your name, where you're coming from, your tribal nation, community, or the organization you work for. Please feel free to also add in your position or title if you would like. So I think we're starting off with a small group, but as people come in, I'll just kind of remind people to do that. So for today's agenda, we're going to start with our guest speaker, Dr. Kelsey Leonard from the Shinnecock Indian Nation and University of Waterloo. I'm just going to go over a little bit on the agenda, what we're going to cover. We'll have a presentation from Dr. Leonard, and we'll have some time for a Q&A as well. Following Dr. Leonard's presentation, we're going to have some announcements on upcoming events and funding opportunities pertinent to the Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northeast regions. We're also going to have an update on the discussions around the Sugar Maple Summit. And for all my Anishinaabe relations on the call, I'm an Eastern Algonquin speaker, but when I look at it, I see Inatik. I believe that's for Sugar Maple. Feel free to correct me if my pronunciation's a little off, but like I said, I'm Eastern Algonquin, but want to honor our relations to all those on the call. Anyways, we're going to have an update on discussion around that. Next, we'll have we'll have some time for some highlights, maybe from your tribal nation or from your organization. Just a little brief round robin, maybe if you would like to share one or two highlights that are happening in your community, nation, or organization. Please feel free to share that. If we run low on time, you can certainly still provide some of those highlights in the chat. So we'll do that. We'll also have some updates from the Northeast and the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Centers. When the meeting concludes, I'm going to ask Dr. Leonard and members of the Advisory Council to stay on the line for our business session. So that's kind of the agenda. And what I'll go ahead and do is, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Kelsey Leonard. And before I go further, Dr. Leonard, what I will do is I'm going to make you a co-host so you can share your screen during your presentation. So we'll go ahead and do participants. And there we go. Okay. Okay, so Dr. Leonard, you're now a co-host and should be able to share your screen. I'll just do a little brief introduction. So Dr. Kelsey Leonard is a citizen of the Shinnecock Indian Nation and represents the Shinnecock Indian Nation on the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, which is charged with protecting America's ocean ecosystems and coastlines. She also serves as a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board of the International Joint Commission. Dr. Leonard is also an assistant professor and faculty in the School of the Environment at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario. Dr. Leonard, thank you very much for joining us today and for your presentation looking at adaptation from tribal nation cultures and perspectives on the East Coast. I'll let you take it away from here. Thank you again, Katapatash. Thank you.
Wonderful, Tabuni. Thank you, Casey, and to everyone. Really excited to be here and joining you all today. So I'm going to start with my slides. Let's get those loaded. All right. Should be loading in a minute. There we go. So today I'm going to talk to you about the WAMPUM adaptation framework in response to sea level rise, which also links to a recent paper in Climate and Development that I published. So just a bit of introductions where I come from. I also want to brief you on sort of the current science around sea level rise and sea level rise impacts in terms of projections and modeling. Then want to go over how sea level rise is impacting tribal nations in terms of water stress and security. And then lastly, turn to a review of what are the existing adaptation frameworks in response to sea level rise, and then where the WAMPUM adaptation framework comes in, and we'll round out with our Q&A today. So as Casey mentioned in my introduction, I am an enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. I think for most folks, I see some familiar faces, so you may not only be familiar with myself, but also with my nation. But for those who aren't, we are located on the east end of what is currently known as Long Island, New York. As you're seeing here in the map, majority of the east end of the island was and is our ancestral territory, but our existing reservation or territory is what you see here in purple, as we are now bordered by the Hamptons, particularly Southampton and Hampton Bays. But what's also really notable about this image, being from the Shinnecock Nation, is we are a coastal Algonquin people. So a lot of our understanding of climate change and climate adaptation is framed by that connection to water and to the ocean. And that also has been very formative in my practice and in scientific research. So why is this important, and why do we need to be thinking about climate adaptation? And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir for this group, but one of the key framings that I like to use is this quote by former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. He says that climate change does not respect borders. It does not respect who you are, rich and poor, small and big. Therefore, this is why we call global challenges, which require global solidarity. And I think that is in large part the impetus behind thinking about adaptation efforts amongst tribes and Indigenous nations more globally, that we actually have a really long track record of scaling up our resources, of working together to build better futures for future generations and for our communities and for our nations. And I think the existing climate crisis gives us even more opportunity to lean into what we do really well, which is to partner with one another and to learn from one another. And it is now needed more than ever before. And I think in a lot of ways, that level of partnership and collaboration and coordination is something that our non-Indigenous colleagues and communities can learn from, and will likely have to learn from as they start to face some of the massive climate events that we have been already facing in our community. So as I mentioned, we're located on the east end of Long Island in New York. What's pictured here is our existing territory of Shinnecock, well, at least a portion of it. There's another portion that that's not seen on the map here. But as I'm kind of circling this with my mouse, hopefully it's coming through, but where you see sort of also that pinpoint, that's kind of the middle of our territory and what we call the Shinnecock Neck. So Shinnecock territory juts out into Shinnecock Bay, our namesake. And so our existing territory is a peninsula surrounded on three sides by water. Then there's that barrier island that you're seeing there, also known as Fire Island, and then the Atlantic Ocean. So when we think about climate change and adaptation to climate change, and trying to plan to address the climate crisis, we really are thinking about some of the really extreme pressures that face us in terms of extreme storm events, extreme precipitation, flooding, and ultimately sea level rise. So that's our existing territory as of 2021 when I pulled these maps from Esri and NOAA's sea level rise simulation. And so when you shift now to the projections of sea level rise, the really red intense color on the map shows under the best case scenario, the likelihood of a 2-foot sea level rise along the Eastern Atlantic, which would then inundate, so flood, all the areas that you see here in red. So we would lose probably, we being Shinnecock, but also our neighbors, would lose about a third of our existing landmass. Now, if we go to the high level projections of up to 6.9 feet of sea level rise, that would be where you kind of are seeing the yellow. So for us at Shinnecock, that means a likelihood of a loss of about half of our existing territory. And I use this map as one example because map granularity is very difficult, but as you'll see in discussion later, these scenarios for Shinnecock are almost replicable or mirror image on every other tribal nation along the Atlantic coast, and particularly many of the nations that are featured in the paper, such as, where Casey's from, Mashpee Wampanoag, where there's also, we feature the Pamunkey Indian tribe in the paper. And so they're, along the Eastern Atlantic, our tribes are really under an imminent threat of sea level rise, given the current modeling and projections in relation to our climate crisis. So that's a call to action. That's a bit of doom and gloom, but it also means that we have to be planning. We have to be working towards adapting to what our new reality is going to look like. Even under a best case scenario, we are going to be having to deal with sea level rise. It's not a question of when, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And in many instances, as I note in subsequent slides, we already are facing these issues, from extreme storm events that lead to storm surge that inundate lands. And so we, in many instances, are already having to adapt to sea level rise. And it's something also that we've done historically, which I'll touch on later. So sea level rise, under the current projections, the science is consistently evolving. So these projections could change, but right now, under the most recent scientific projections, particularly for the Northeast, we are seeing that sea levels could rise in the region by as much as 6.9 feet by 2100. This is in large part due to the climate crisis, to the increasing level of carbon emissions across our planet, also leading to glacier melt and then rising seas, as well as ocean warming. So it's all coupled together, but then it has real impacts in terms of sea level rise as sort of being I wouldn't even say the human impact, it's a planetary impact of the increase in emissions and planetary warming. So again, the best case scenario in terms of timelines, and I like this map because it sort of shows a fuller extent of what's covered in the paper and what we're facing in terms of Eastern tribal nations. The paper and my discussion is very much focused on sort of the mid-Atlantic through the Northeast, but also inclusive of our relations across the imagined border to Canada, and our relations to the South, particularly Southeastern coastal tribes, who are facing similar experiences. So I think much of what I present today will also resonate with them, and some of them have also expressed that it does resonate. So it's a part of having these global conversations for global solidarity, even across the wide swaths of regions that our tribal nations come from. So under best case scenario, we're looking at by 2050, this could, some projections are saying this even could happen sooner than 2050, but at least a high end of 2 feet of rise. Beyond 2050, this is where, if we're able to curb our carbon emissions, we have a really unique opportunity here to limit the impact of sea level rise for tribes. So beyond 2050, under moderate emissions, which means meeting our Paris Agreement targets and the other initiatives to curb carbon emissions, that we would likely see the sort of by 2050, 1.4 feet of rise, by 2100, 3.3 feet of rise. Under moderate emissions, but a high end rise, it could be 2.6 by 2050 and 6.9 by 2100. If we don't meet our Paris target agreements, which even there's been some recent science and data coming out in relation to COVID-19, that we thought, okay, people aren't traveling, we've reduced our flying, and we've reduced a lot of consumption, so maybe we'll meet the annual emissions reduction rate of around 7%, and we actually only made it to 6.2%. And so there is really a large concern as to whether or not the reduction rates that are needed are even achievable. So if we're not meeting that moderate emissions, if we're exceeding the rates, then this level of sea level rise could be even greater than we are projecting. And that's a big concern for us as tribes in trying to think about planning and adaptation. So what are the potential impacts of sea level rise? So we have all of our nations, and much credit to the Northeast team for helping with this and adapting. I know that there's also been some new iterations. So maps I like to think of them as living documents, but we recognize that we have, over 30 federally recognized tribes in the region. Also those, that number expands if we think about tribal nations with historic connections to the region. So sea level rise is not just impacting one tribal nation, it's impacting all of us, and oftentimes impacting the way in which we interact with each other. And so this is from increased flooding to permanent inundation of our tribal coastal areas. It could also be wetland loss and migration. And as you start to lose wetlands or they migrate, that also impacts your ability to have a level of ecosystem resilience to storm surge. And even as we think about carbon emissions, we recognize that wetlands are strong sources of areas for carbon sequestration. And if we start to lose those, then we lose sort of that natural aid and sort of natural warrior to fight off a lot of what we are putting into our environment. So that's a concern. Saltwater intrusion as well. So rising seas means the potential for saltwater intrusion into our drinking water systems, but saltwater intrusion into, for us at Shinnecock and a lot of eastern coastal nations, it also means estuary environments. So if you shift that salinity, it changes ecosystems and habitats that have sustained relatives and species for millennia. And then, there's the human side of it, drinking water contamination issues, cultural impacts, cultural resource impacts. And lastly, an area that I'll touch on is around displacement. So as you saw with our map of Shinnecock, that very much could be mirrored across other tribes. If we are losing land being inundated due to sea level rise, where do we go? And there's, again, a federal Indian law question, a question of, oppressive colonial systems that don't allow for proper relocation. Carcieri comes in, so it becomes very, very complicated. But I want to focus today on drinking water contamination, and that's what I also focus on in the paper. Tribal nations face distinct challenges to water security, given the increasing sea level rise threats. And so what are some of these increasing threats that pose water stress to tribes? Infrastructure issues, so either infrastructure being compromised due to flooding and storm surge that leads to greater deterioration or increased rate of deterioration. We also have population growth, which is amazing. We're having babies, but as you start to see inundation of lands, which means loss of lands, which means loss of livable areas, how do we sustain our population growth? Again, lack of ability to acquire new lands comes in as well, carcieri, trust lands, different land status, real big issues of concern. That leads into land loss, and then we also talk about issues around flooding and storm surge, the ways in which those can contaminate systems, or even just put systems offline. And offline for how long? Could that be a day? Could it be a week? In the case of Hurricane Sandy, we saw infrastructure issues that lasted well over a month. And so how do we ensure that we have enough disaster risk reduction planning in place to allow for emergency management response? And water security is not just about our freshwater and drinking water concerns, but it's also about wastewater and the way storm surge and flooding events can lead to complications with our wastewater systems. And that has massive implications for us as well along the coast, because if those systems overflow, they then overflow into our natural and marine environments, causing bigger issues for those estuarine ecosystems. It's sometimes what we call nitrogen bombs because of those wastewater contaminants sort of leaching into our water and marine environment and causing more problems, algal blooms, for example, et cetera. So what do we do? Well, generally, when we have a climate change problem, we look to climate change adaptation plans to give us some guidance. If we're looking at the context of the Northeast and we look at the different climate change adaptation plans throughout the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast that have been put out by states, very few of them, if any, actually mention tribes. And even more so, very few, if any, go further enough to actually have clear sections, clear action items and areas to address, tribal concerns in relation to climate change adaptation, to have action items that actually directly link to tribal action areas and to tribal initiatives and to tribal sovereignty and authority and jurisdiction. So in large instance, we have now moved to creating our own plans and initiatives and activities, some of which have been in large part led or supported by USET and by many of the folks on the line today. In addition to the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resiliency Program. And so that's sort of what you're seeing here on the map. Yellow circles being indicative of planning and assessment activities that have been funded through the program. Green crosses are around monitoring and research. Purple around governance and capacity building. Red triangles, adaptation implementation, and blue stars, youth and cultural continuity. The thing is, though, is we don't really see as much activity in terms of the funding of resilience actions by tribes along the eastern seaboard. And so I hope in the future we start to see more initiatives in this space because it's, as you'll see from the paper, it's definitely very needed. And when we look at adaptation plans, within those plans, there generally is some context by which to respond to sea level rise. And they usually are framed in the context of adaptation frameworks. If we look at the international level, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put out a few reports, one report on sea level rise in 2019 that also included adaptation strategies and measures and also included a framework to advise nations, communities, peoples around the world to adapt to sea level rise and how to respond. And so this was one example of those frameworks. In the IPCC report, they actually named the framework as a generic framework. And you can see here that some of these strategies are planned retreat, which is moving away from the sea line, to accommodate, which is to sort of build up infrastructure so that it can withstand storm surge or rising seas. Accommodate, which is to do a mixture of hard and soft engineering infrastructure, like building seawalls, levees, dikes, things like that, to reduce the impact of storm surge and flooding. There's also protect, which is, again, building out more hard defenses as well as soft defenses, as you can see here in the image. And then attack, which is a new one, which is around land claim and development. So it's kind of building out into attack, which is building out into the sea. There's been some areas in which this has been done in other parts of the world. And so it may be something as sea level rise becomes a more pressing issue that is also carried out in the context of North America. So what I see, or what I saw in trying to look at these adaptation frameworks, was a clear gap in the adaptation frameworks actually being responsive to local context. And when I was examining a lot of the literature, there were two really distinct pieces that spoke to why there might be an absence of actual Indigenous knowledge, science, and presence in these adaptation frameworks. And the two pieces were Marino, who in 2018 said that the concept of, introduced the concept of adaptation oppression, where she highlighted that Western scientific and cultural biases are reflected in the very limited adaptation options that are present in existing frameworks. So really being able to identify and show that what we're seeing in terms of existing adaptation frameworks have been designed from a Eurocentric Western perspective and aren't necessarily inclusive of the communities that bear the disproportionate burden of having to adapt to sea level rise. And Hardy et al. Mentioned something similar as well, calling it a form of colorblind adaptation planning that overlooks racial inequality and systemic racism, and the way in which that also has an influence on our environmental governance institutions. So what we see then is if we look at these existing strategies to protect, accommodate, retreat, avoid attack, they're often called PARA for short. It's very militarized and combative language. There's no real connection to culture. There's the design in itself. There's no Indigenous design. So we're very visual people. Our culture speaks to being based on a lot of visual material. And so not seeing yourself reflected in design can also be a form of cultural violence and even sort of a systemic extension of climate change violence towards communities. And taking it a step further, all of the adaptation measures and strategies put forward by the IPCC and in other literature, again, written from that Western perspective, are very human-centric. It's all about what you humans need to adapt to sea level rise or to save their houses, et cetera, but not so much about what do our more than human relations need to adapt. So in response to that, we created the WAMPUM adaptation framework as sort of a theoretical exploration of what would this look like if we were going to respond to what Marino and Hardy said about existing strategies being colorblind, being based in Eurocentrism. What would it look like if we designed our own adaptation framework? And we built it off of already existing innovative work that tribes along the Eastern Seaboard are already doing. So we created the WAMPUM adaptation framework. It stands for Witness, Acknowledge, Mend, Protect, Unite, and Move. I'll also post the link to the article in the chat box for folks to download if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it. It goes into more detail than what I'm able to provide today. But witness means to witness warnings from human and non-human relations and follow the patterns of the natural world. So this principle was very much inspired by the work of Elizabeth James Perry, who works to protect our oceans and coastal ecosystems. She is an Aquinnah Wampanoag citizen, and she underscores the critical aspect of SLR for her tribal nation, noting that Indigenous knowledge is about careful, respectful observation and cooperation with natural systems for sustainable future. We are doing so much already as tribal nations to respond to the unusual mortality events we've been seeing with our whale relatives, to respond as well to other species that are of cultural species of distinct cultural importance that we are worried about, that are giving us these sort of messages and our kind of natural warning system. And it's imperative upon us to witness that and to respond. And the other part of witness is that the Western world likes to call it biomimicry in the context of climate change. It's already something, Indigenous people told you so type of thing, we've been doing it for thousands of years. But if we're witnessing how the natural world is responding to these climatic changes, we can also try and have a bit of biomimicry, which is to mimic how that response and allow for us to adapt as Indigenous people. So the next principle is acknowledge, which is to acknowledge the traditional teachings and restore cultural stewardship practices. So what do we mean? Well, it really was to highlight a lot of the work that tribal nations and communities have been doing, such as the Native Land Conservancy, to steward and restore our traditional land conservation practices. So NLC is actually the first Indigenous-led conservation organization in the Eastern US. You will have seen a recent news article as well, I believe for either Passamaquoddy or Penobscot, on the reacquisition of land and of an island space. And so I think we're going to see more of that, both with our land back movements, and, potentially water back movements, and really thinking through, for so long, our stewardship and conservation practices were prohibited, were made illegal. And so now we're in this process of reclamation and restoration, and that can go a long way in contributing to how we design our adaptation strategies to sea level rise. The next principle is mend, which is mend the shoreline and practice healing for coastal and environmental sovereignty. So what do we mean by that? So my own nation, Shinnecock, led a living shoreline project, or what's called in Western world a living shoreline project, that really prioritized Indigenous knowledge to address shoreline erosion using nature-based solutions for healing of our coastal areas. So in our language, Shinnecock means people of the stony shore. So what we, after Superstorm Sandy, we had a significant amount of beach erosion. And so to allow for the reduction of tidal wave energy, which would allow for less impacts from storm surge, we built out our living shoreline along our coast to include more stones, to really sort of lean into that traditional teaching that is sort of embodied inherently in us as Shinnecock, and have that be a part of the restoration project. We also, really lent into restoration through seagrasses, particularly eelgrass. There was a massive amount of eelgrass planting, which also is not only carbon sequestration activity and action, but a way to reduce storm surge and to prevent against erosion. And then we also did plantings for shellfish. Again, that helps with water quality and shoreline maintenance. And we're not alone. Pamunkey Indian Tribe is also in the process of building a living shoreline. And so these living shorelines, which are sometimes referred to as nature-based climate solutions in the Western literature, are really, really great ways for us to adapt to sea level rise and to, really lean in to mending and to fostering that responsibility we have to the natural world, and can help us to be able to stay in our homeland. The next principle is protect, which stands for protect future generations by protecting cultural sites and ancestors. In this one, I wanted to highlight one of the aspects where we're already doing this work, which is in cultural resource protection through either grave rematriation. So we may have to, some of our grave sites are going to be impacted by sea level rise. So planning and thinking through how do we rematriate, relocate those graves in an authentic and ethical process that respects those ancestors. But then also sometimes grave rematriation is leaving things where they are, but being able to continue to steward those places. And we kind of have that capacity already built through the work that we've been doing with underwater archaeology. Some of the images here are from the University of Rhode Island's project with Narragansett. And the Narragansett tribe has been building out, strong technical capacity for underwater archaeology, which is to not only document submerged cultural resources, but to steward them and protect them and maintain that relationship for generations to come. And the next principle is unite, which is unite with other communities to build capacity and plan relocation. And we highlighted the work of UTSET and really showing what it means to scale up resources across tribes, to learn from each other, to say, how did these climate adaptation strategies work for you? What else could we be doing to have that work in our community? Or you tried this, but it didn't work. So let's not add that to our plan. So really highlighting the innovative work that the tribal climate resilience camps have been doing, and UTSET as well. And as well, also some of the work that many of you on the call have been leading over the years. And the last principle is move, which means move to new places with cultural connections and rebuild. And so we noticed in that also the Passamaquoddy tribe at their Pleasant Point or Sipiak Reservation has faced increasing shoreline erosion impacting water infrastructure, including their wastewater treatment plant. So they have done some hard and mixture of hard and soft defenses to sort of rebuild that shoreline so that the wastewater treatment plant can stay intact. But it's likely, given the sea level rise projections that I showed you earlier, that could be inundated by sea level rise in future years. So there may be a need to relocate. Same thing as I showed at the start of our conversation, there may be a need to relocate in the context of Shinnecock and other tribal nations. It's really just sort of a mirrored process. And what I've been advocating for is sort of building the science, but then also taking the science and taking that to Capitol Hill and saying, in the new legislation that's being put forward around the climate crisis, we need to have, ocean-based climate solutions that allow for a climate migration fund accessible to tribes, probably as well to other communities, so that we are able to relocate, and that in that process of relocation, we don't lose our land status. And I think that there's some strong movement, definitely movement that was formerly supported by Congresswoman Deb Haaland and now Secretary Haaland. So I think that that's probably something that we're going to see more movement on in the next few years. And why is this important? It's important because, our land, our territory is who we are as Indigenous people. It's who we are as Shinnecock people, and being able to, restore that shore, protect that shore for future generations is integral to how we, protect ourselves as nations too. So I just wanted to highlight some of the real great work that's happening across our tribes. And we'll turn it over now to questions. Sorry, Casey, if I went over time.
No problem. Katapatash. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Leonard. And yes, we do have time for questions. We have, pretty good sized group. So I think what we can do is, please feel free. I don't see the hand raise function particularly on this one, but if you wave your hand or you can react with the waving hand, that works too. So I think we have Kirk Havens. Hello, Kirk. You have a question?
Yeah, and thank you for this. Will be my first meeting with the group, so thank you for the invitation. And Kelsey, that was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate hearing it. And I've been trying to work with some of the tribes in southeastern Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay, with the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi and such. And one of the issues that continuously rises up, they're all interested in developing implementation of adaptation plans, but the issue seems to be in capacity. In these tribal nations, they simply don't have, they're all working other jobs, and they simply don't have the staff capacity to try to move these forwards, or even seek grants and to try to get the capacity. And so I don't know. I just wondered some of your thoughts on it. May be necessary for some of the grant proposals that are out there that they would allow for, like up to 5 years in order to build a capacity for some of these tribes to be able to develop the plans, but also have the ability to then to try to self-sustain themselves from being able to put it together proposals and grant writing, which takes a lot of time. So I just wanted some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Casey might even be, and there probably are others that can speak to that as well. But I think one of the things in terms of the program that I mentioned earlier, the BA Tribal Resilience Program, there are different levels and stages of categories. So I think there are a few capacity building grants that are available through that program, so that tribes actually can just sort of invest those grant funds to the planning activities of building the capacity. And then then you can apply in subsequent years for the larger sort of planning, drafting, and maybe implementation of one action item within that plan. So there are a few different layers and levels to that program. I am definitely an advocate for regional plans. I think it's still important for each tribal nation to have their own plan, because there is a distinct cultural insight that comes in doing that. And there needs to be a bit of ownership and buy-in, especially when you're dealing in an emergency response disaster risk reduction issue. you need folks to be aware. But then I think once that's completed, it's totally reasonable to have a collaborative plan that happens at a regional scale. But Casey, what are your thoughts? How's that been working? I mean, that's USET's wheelhouse.
Strength and unity, right? So, what I'd just like to add to that is, having been a former director of environmental department, we had a staff of, we maxed out at 4, but we were usually working between 2 and 3 staff. And so capacity, yes, was a major concern. But what I think is also important is with climate change adaptation planning, all too often it may fall in the lap, so to speak, of a tribal environmental department or a natural resource department. And that particular natural resource department maybe has a staff of 10 or maybe has a staff of 1. I think what needs to be advocated more, especially in climate adaptation planning, is for intra-tribal like departments to work with each other on the plan, because it doesn't just affect like things that maybe the environmental or natural resource department would be responsible for. You want to make sure that if you have a culture and heritage department, you're communicating with them. If you have an emergency department, you're communicating with them. So that kind of builds your capacity internally a little bit, and also makes sense, because if you have a roads and grounds department or agency in your tribal nation, sea level rise is going to impact that too. Just as Dr. Leonard had pointed out, wastewater management and things like that. So I, again, push for kind of internal capacity building and making sure everyone is at the table within the tribe of planning for climate change and dealing with climate change. And as Dr. Leonard was saying also, yes, with the BIA funding, there is funding for those tribal nations that have a sense that maybe being understaffed and employing people to make partner relationships between the tribal nations surrounding other jurisdictions as well. So I just want to add on that. But yeah, it's definitely an issue of concern.
I think
Thank you both.
There's also a lot of funding through federal, state, and university programs. So the funding streams that tribes have kind of been excluded from or not been able to tap into was also a large, catalyst for writing this paper, because what we see sort of Western scientists utilizing the IPCC framework to say, oh, this is how you should adapt to sea level rise, and trying to then sort of put that onto tribes without really any critical reflection or introspection as to whether or not it's actually a good fit. Joe Kalt and the folks at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development and the Native Nations Institute talk about cultural match. And there was just a lot of cultural mismatch with how large climate change adaptation planning is happening across the United States, and then how it's being put or sort of forced upon tribes. And there's a lot of funding attached to that. So, in the context of New York State, why should New York State be getting all of this federal funding and not have an obligation to be inclusive of tribes? Oftentimes they've been saying, oh, we don't know how. So this is also in part trying to, marry the two of, now you can't say you don't know how, and you don't know how to engage, and you don't know how to frame these conversations in an ethical manner.
Awesome, thank you. And we still have a little bit of time. If anyone has another question, feel free to on the reaction, the clapping hand symbol, or kind of get my attention on camera. I think, yes, excellent. We have a question from Olivia Ledee.
Oh, I was clapping to clap, Casey, not to ask a question. Kelsey, it's great to see you again. I'll just do a plug for the water session that she and others participated in that's still available in the shifting seasons. I mean, it was a great conversation. So I had the luxury of, moderating. So thanks for joining us today.
Nice to see you again.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. And I just wanted to mention something too. So, Dr. Leonard, you had mentioned, for example, the CARCR decision. That's Sometimes for those on the call, it's a Supreme Court decision, I think came out in 2009, and colloquially, I guess unfortunately, we kind of referred to it as a carcieri fix. It essentially made it really, really difficult for tribal nations, particularly on the East Coast, to have lands placed in trust, and especially tribal nations that have been in places for thousands of years, but may not have had formal federal recognition in a key date of 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act. We've seen, historically a lot of pushback from other jurisdictions when tribal nations push to, have land placed in trust. And in the climate change context, you think about sea level rise and its impact on where people live, where they have homes and roads, and inundation, and people not able to live in that place. Or as I heard from Chief Robert Gray from the Pamunkey tribe, like if a place doesn't pass a perk test, like if you go through and test the soil and it's too saturated, you can't build on it. So you can't build on it for future generations. So it might not be covered with water, but it's still unlivable. And so you have to think about that. And even if there are people, if there's a place where maybe there isn't a house or infrastructure, but has a place of culturally important plants and ecosystems and whatnot, these are places that maybe you, as tribal nations, would want to have in trust, or kind of around that salt marsh migration, where people we're starting to look at, if sea level rises this much, where can the salt marsh go? And is it blocked by a road or a high elevation terrain and things like that? And if not, is there lands that can be protected using that foresight of where it's likely to be? So I think what we hope is, a change in, of this. Carcieri was the governor of Rhode Island. For context, there was pushback to the Narragansett tribe for exerting their sovereignty on their own land. And that wound up into the Supreme Court. And to this day, it's still an issue, and hopefully will be addressed and changed, because tribal nations who are needing to build or protect areas from things like sea level rise, that is another, guess what you call institutional or inhibiting factor. So.
Yeah, so many really great points there. And one of the things that I'm starting to notice, this particular framing was in the context of water security, and there's only so many words, but I hope that folks will take the framework and apply it in other contexts. But in the relation to sort of the aesthetic of design, and you sort of see these like white picket nuclear family houses on all of these adaptation visuals, sea level rise adaptation visuals. It was trying to expand beyond that notion, which is going to be really important legislatively for tribes, because a lot of our Eastern tribal nations, we've codified the types of housing we can have, and it's based on previous BIA federal policies, probably through different types of HUD grants and what was available. So the housing is also not to the grade that we need it to be for climate adaptation and for being, building resilient housing infrastructure. So what do I mean by that? Well, some housing policies for tribal nations require you to build a foundation. But there are plenty of houses around the world where they don't build foundations. Their houses are on stilts. Their houses are built in such a manner as to be able to live in relation to the changing environment. And so we have a very closed-minded sort of nuclear approach to housing infrastructure, particularly in the United States, that for tribes is going to just have to be completely done away with. We had this whole thing because there was kind of this stereotype of all of our communities like living in trailers. So a lot of tribes have rules where you can't have a trailer on your territory. Well, maybe having a trailer or a mobile home or a tiny house is actually really a good idea, given our changing climate and how we might have to be more mobile. So all of that is to say that we need to be having these conversations. I think it speaks to what you said, your question earlier, Kirk, we also need to be having these internal questions, internal conversations to answer these questions and build that capacity that Kelsey mentioned in relation to how do we adapt and make it really plausible and feasible to our needs and our current resource capacity.
Awesome. Thank you again, Dr. Leonard. And I think what we want to do is I'm going to go ahead and move us to the next part of our agenda. So thank you again. And Dr. Leonard's put a link to her paper on the WAMPUM adaptation framework. Also in the chat is I placed the link to the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network. So again, if this is your first opportunity to join a quarterly meeting, please do take the time to visit the web link and learn more about the network. Let me go ahead and move to our next agenda. And Kataptash, thank you very much, Dr. Leonard. A wonderful presentation. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll go over some announcements coming up. So let me start right here. And share screen. Okay. Okay, so first announcement coming up, the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, or AT&I, and partners are holding the fourth session of the National Tribal Leadership Climate Change Summit. The theme of session 4 is traditional knowledges and tribal sovereignty. It will occur on June 8th, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific. So that's going to be 1 p.m. Eastern or 12 noon Central. I've been a part of the planning committee for these sessions and I've attended each one. So very fulfilling sessions, a lot of knowledge holders, tribal leaders, tribal youth and elders from across the country. So I encourage people to check that out. And so I'll definitely make sure those links are in there. Registration is free. You just got to go and register and you'll get the Zoom link to attend. Next, coming up this summer is the USET Tribal Resilience Camp. This, by the word camp, of course, was intended to be in person, but we understand tribal nations and communities are still, citizens are still receiving the vaccine, and things are opening up, and we want to be really mindful to allow the time for that to do so. We're going to do a virtual event. This is geared toward tribal program staff, tribal leaders, or citizens from tribal nations interested or feel the priority of having a climate change adaptation plan or vulnerability assessment for their tribal nation and community. So we have a webpage where you can learn more about this. We're encouraging tribal nation teams to register. So an example of kind of an ideal team is a team of maybe a tribal leader, a tribal program director, and maybe early career professional or tribal citizen. The idea of having a tribal teams or delegations participate is that maybe if one person goes to a conference or goes to a meeting, you come back with a lot of information, but if like 3 people people experience it from their different backgrounds and they get to bring this really diverse knowledge back. So we're encouraging tribal teams. Registration is open until May 31st. We have kind of a cap of about 30 attendees. Reason being, we want this to be a very intimate kind of close training and experience with facilitators. Just kind of an FYI on that. Another announcement. This summer, the Native Youth Community Adaptation Leadership Congress is occurring. The registration deadline for this has passed, but just want to share with everyone what this is and what's happening. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and other partners have funded this each summer for high school youth from tribal nations, Native communities to come together to, have opportunities to build leadership in the area around addressing climate change in their own home communities. I think the group that participates is our high school juniors and seniors, or those going into their senior year, excuse me. So this has occurred every summer. So just kind of wanted to share with everyone about this program, and definitely keep eyes open. This is actually going to happen virtually also. Hopefully it will be in person again next summer. We have also a conference coming up that is the 9th World Conference on Ecological Restoration, happening June 21st through the 24th. I believe this is also a virtual event where you can register. Also coming up is the 5th Women and Water Coming Together Symposium on the Lakota Reservation with Wisconsin. I think this also, I'm not sure if this is virtual or in person, but if you know, please feel free to let us and those of us on the call know. But in any case, here is the save the date. That's August 1st through the 5th. Let me go ahead and move over to some funding opportunities that are coming down the line. We have the funding opportunity from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Tribal Wildlife Grants Program. The deadline for this funding opportunity is June 18th. I believe these are for fairly recognized tribal governments to apply, or an agency of a tribal government, such as an environmental department or natural resource department. I think these are also very good opportunities to apply for, particularly if you have species or relations, animal relations of concern, or habitat or ecosystem of concern. So this is a very good funding opportunity. Also, from the USDA National Institute for Food and, NIFA, Food and Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, Foundational and Applied Science Program. This deadline is July 29th. So any in the sphere of agriculture, food security, or even some of our food sovereignty initiatives, I think this is a possible grant opportunity. This is an opportunity for more tribal organizations or tribal colleges, for example, 1994 land grant institutions, 501c3 nonprofits. So kind of keep an eye out for this one. And we have the Native Small Business Grant opportunity. The National Congress of American Indians is offering business stabilization grants in the amount of $5,000 each to a total of 28 selected Native-owned small businesses that have been severely impacted by the curtailing of commercial activity caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. There isn't necessarily an application deadline. It's a rolling application. The window for applications will remain as long or until funds have been exhausted. So just wanted to share those. I'll go ahead and stop screen share for a moment. Want to segue into another topic. So there's been discussion on Sugar Maple Summit, and I'd like to see if anyone on the call on the network would like to give a little update on where that's at, how things are kind of going with that, and kind of next steps. So is there any on the network call that would like to give an update on the Sugar Maple Summit?
Casey, I guess I can do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob.
So we're still really early in the process with this. What we've determined at this point is we're going to start off hopefully with one or more storytelling sessions that will be virtual. And we're currently planning that and looking for funding for that, with the hope that we can then take information gathered during those storytelling sessions and use it to help plan a larger workshop or gathering that would help us develop products that would facilitate Forest Service research and things like that into sugar maple. But as I said, we're still really very early on in the planning phase. So I don't want people to get too excited too quickly.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Rob. Rob Crawl from Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So yeah, some really great discussions that are happening. I think bringing tribal nations, communities, and people together, thinking about ways to protect and continue the sugar maple and its importance in many of our nations and communities. So please stay tuned. We'll be sure to give updates as things go along. Thank you, Marie. I see in the chat, there's also another NIPI or water gathering happening this week. So the link to that is in the chat. Thank you very much, Marie, for sharing that. All right, so let me go ahead and segue into our round robin here, round robin updates. I think we're still doing pretty good on time. We have the time for the next 10 or so minutes before we go into the advisory council session. But want to kind of put it out there and see if any on the call wish to share any other updates from your tribal organizations, communities, highlights. Feel free to do so right now. And then we'll go into some updates from the Northeast and Midwest CASC.
Well, Casey, this is Kirk. And again, I'm really mostly here to just listen, but as my first joining of this group. But I will follow up, Casey, with something that we had talked about earlier, which is we have established a scholar in residency for ocean, coastal, and island culture, Indigenous practices and ways of knowing. And the inaugural person that has accepted that position is Nainoa Thompson, the Poe navigator, Native Hawaiian navigator that captains the Hukalea. And so we're excited about that. And, the purpose of this or the position will help advance, kind of the shared values of ecological restoration and climate change resilience, based on the notions of balance, interconnectivity, trust, and the melding of Indigenous wisdom with scientific knowledge. So that's the goal, and we're excited that he's agreed to be part of that.
Awesome. That's a wonderful update. Thank you, Kurt, for sharing that in your neck of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Any other updates from those on the call from our organizations, communities, nations, things we're doing, events? Hello.
Hi, all. Hi. Just a quick update from 1854 Treaty Authority. We're working with the Minnesota Tribal Environmental Council to compile a list of all of the climate adaptation plans, projects, even things that are coming up that tribes in Minnesota are currently or have worked on or are pending. So we're hoping to have that list. It's currently in spreadsheet form completed by the end of June, with a draft kind of ready to go to be shared with partners by mid-July. So possibly just stay tuned. That might be a useful thing for folks to take to their various organizations and meetings, and just share among their networks to get a better sense of what each of the tribes around here are doing related to climate.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, Hillary. And that's so important because I know with staff and departments that we work with, a lot of people are looking for examples, like whether it's templates or just an example of taking that first step and approach in an adaptation plan. So thank you for sharing that. All right. I'll go ahead and segue over to the Northeast and Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Centers. Again, if something comes to mind and you have an announcement you want to share, please feel free to add it into the chat and we'll make sure everyone gets that. But I'll start with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. As Tribal Liaison, I work closely with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And just one quick announcement, we've been working to partner with the University of Maine Native American program on a project which in a similar fashion to the tribal adaptation menu and using its principles of community engagement and tribal cultures as foundations in adaptation planning. We're going to be exploring that, especially in the Wabanaki or the Dawnland nations, as well as that which can be applicable for tribal nations in all across the Northeast. So it's kind of an exploratory project and being worked on by Dr. Darren Ranko up at the University of Maine Native American programs. So that's exciting. We look forward to a year or more of continuing to build relationships between tribal nations and the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center in the context of community-based and culturally based adaptation planning. Let me hand it over to Deputy Federal Director Rachel Reagan. I think there's a virtual event the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center is working on this year. Deputy Reagan, would you like to share a little bit about that event?
Yeah, thank you so much. I haven't met this group before, so I'm Rachel Reagan, and I'm in an acting position as Deputy Director for the Northeast CASC right now. I actually come from the West Coast, and so I'm more familiar with the West Coast tribal issues, especially in the Puget Sound and the Columbia River Basin. So this was a fantastic presentation to hear from you, Kelsey. I really appreciated learning about it, hearing your style and showing, your visuals. I really appreciated that talk. So thank you very much. The Northeast CASC, there's a couple of updates I wanted to share. One was that we're currently organizing a science symposium that's going to take place virtually in October on the 26th to the 28th. It's intended for researchers, resource managers, tribal partners, anybody living in the northeastern U.S. and who are studying or managing for climate adaptation. Let's see, it's got a few different elements where we are trying to get a keynote speaker, and Deb Holland is one of the people that we're talking about asking to do a short keynote speaker presentation for us, as well as some other people. It has a mix of presentations on some of the science that we've been doing in themes like cumulative and interactive threats, like invasive species, land use change, vulnerability status and needs assessments, connectivity, refugia, and restoration adaptation strategies. We have a couple of different panels. One's focused with a bunch of different agencies on different management issues. We also have a panel that's focused just on tribal, looking at cultural resources, looking at climate adaptation, different ways to expand our capacity and better serve our tribes. And then there's also some workshops and training that we're developing. So I wanted to let everybody know about that, and it's still in the works. So we're still developing it, but that'll be in October. And another thing that we're doing at the Northeast CASC is we're focusing on developing a new strategic science plan, which would last for 5 years. And the intention with that is we use that to kind of strategize where we're going to spend our our focus for the next 5 years, both in terms of research and efforts. And so we're currently in the process of developing that. And so we are integrating a lot of tribal input, looking to find out what some of the questions and needs are, and making sure that we address that in our strategic science plan. Those are the two big ones. Yeah, happy to meet everybody. So thank you, Casey.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and segue over to Federal Director of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, Olivia Ledee. Hello, Olivia. Good to see you. Want to share some announcements from the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center?
Yeah, good to see you too, Casey. It's been a while. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all doing well, enjoying spring, despite allergies. I can see the side of allergies on my face right now. Not too many updates. I think I gave, we talked about the call for host proposals for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. I know folks are well aware, and proposals are due next month. We hope to have a decision and an award in place in September. So that's very exciting. I've shared that, we had a call out for project proposals. Folks are aware of that. We called 21 projects to full proposal stage. So pleased with that, and won't have those projects starting until about spring of next year. The only other bit that was more substantial since the last quarterly meeting is that we sent a letter to tribal leaders, federally recognized tribal nations in the Midwest region, so 39, to leaders. We made sure to copy, so we both sent letters as well as emails, and copied all of the natural resource staff, offering a consultation, a formal consultation as we set up the center, offering and inquiring about interest on serving on the advisory committee, offering one-on-one conversations, and then we're also scheduling a conference call in June for folks who are interested. Some of you sort of participated in that discussion that we had about tribal needs, and so Sarah and I are going to facilitate a similar conversation with folks who are interested. Received response from a few communities and nations so far, have already had one-on-ones, including council president from Gun Lake and natural resource staff, and they're trickling in. And out of that, we've already gotten to natural resource departments that are working on revising adaptation plans that are looking for support and information on climate change. So yeah, excited about that, and hope to see more trickling in.
Awesome. That's wonderful news. Thank you very much, Olivia, for sharing that coming out of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So we're going to kind of wind down the presentation and announcements part of the meeting. Before those who are attending go, I want to just give a heads up. So these meetings, again, are going to be quarterly. So we'll probably have our next one in August. Our invited presenter is Molly Willosin. She is from NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Institute, on the release of their Tribal Drought Engagement Strategy. So that'll be next time. And we will again give updates during that time. In the meantime, please do continue to visit the website, the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network, for events that are coming up. Want to stay in contact with our group. So I think at this time, I would ask, see if we can have our Dr. Leonard and the Advisory Council stay on. And all others, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you continue to participate as part of the network.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Definitely.
Hi, everyone.